Hey everyone, and welcome to The Rational Republican, a podcast where we look at complex issues facing us here in Oregon and around the nation. We'll try to address issues from a nonpartisan perspective and view our disagreements through a lens of respect rather than tribalism or divisiveness. I'm James Ball. This is Nick Perlasky.
Hey listeners, how we doing?
Today's podcast is brought to you by ProLift Garage Doors. ProLift is your one-stop shop for residential and small commercial garage doors, from openers, springs, and rollers to full reinstalls. They offer same-day service on all garage door repairs with no extra charge for evenings or weekends. Serving the greater Portland metro area, call today and set up your free estimate at 503-558-6349 or at proliftdoors.com/Portland. Again, that's 503-558-6349 or proliftdoors.com/Portland. On this episode of the podcast, once again, just me and Nick, no guest for you today. And we're actually talking about maybe just doing a few more of these with just Nick and me rather than trying to find a guest every couple of weeks. Turns out that that's kind of a tall order.
The summer doldrums, and there's session, and there's campaigns starting to kick into gear.
And
we'll talk about all that stuff, but just not always with the people who are involved in them.
Exactly. So one of the things we wanted to touch on this week was the Texas abortion law that just went into effect recently, which basically says you can't have abortions after the 6th week of pregnancy, which is, I guess, when you can detect a fetal heartbeat, I think is the rationale for the 6-week.
That was the idea. I think they were calling it the heartbeat bill, and that's the idea behind it.
Yeah. So effectively making abortion illegal, because I would imagine I'm not an expert on this. I've never been pregnant, so I can't tell you for sure.
Of.
Right. I mean, who knows? Maybe I have. But I would my understanding, a lot of times you don't know that you're pregnant until you've missed a period, which is 4 weeks in. So then you have literally single-digit number of days to decide if you want to have an abortion or not at that point.
And it is something like, it's in the 90% of the number of pregnancies that are terminated is after the 6-week mark. There's kind of a window there of it. I remember probably 8 or 10 years ago, this was Wendy Davis, the gal who ran for governor in Texas. She became famous because she was filibustering a 24-week abortion ban. And that was another one that Democrats got all hot and bothered. And it's something like 2% of abortions occur after the 24-week mark. You guys are arguing about literally like 18 procedures or something like that. Like, what are we talking about here? But this obviously is much different, because this is the vast, vast, vast majority of actual abortions are performed after 6 weeks. So this is, as you said, effectively bans the practice of abortion in the state of Texas.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to get out of the way early is you are a male, I believe.
This is true.
And I also am a male.
This is also true.
Neither of us is capable of getting pregnant. So are we allowed to talk about this? Are we allowed to have an opinion on the topic of abortion?
So I will say, personally, for me, I did talk to a couple of different people of the female persuasion and said, would you be interested in coming on? And I, with scheduling and whatever we did, as James kind of led with at the top, we weren't able to get anybody else. So if the fact that it's just two males, and especially two white males, two white straight cis males of relative privilege, if that's not your cup of tea to talk about abortion, then please by all means turn us off. I would have liked to give whatever little platform we had, I would have liked to have a female voice on here, because I think it would have been interesting to hear a perspective other than just our own, because you and I hang out a lot and we kind of know each other's perspectives pretty well already. It's true. But obviously at the same time, yeah, as you said, neither of us has been pregnant, neither of us ever will be pregnant, and regardless of any individual woman's feelings about abortion, they're also going to be the ones who experience pregnancy and what it's like to have morning sickness and what it's like to weigh the idea of whether you want to have an abortion, weigh the idea of, if it's not a person you're in a committed relationship with, is he going to be able to support you emotionally and financially? And there's a lot of different decisions that go in on there that you and I are never going to have the heft to be able to actually discuss with any lived experience, as the term goes.
Sure.
I feel like that said, though, it is a policy debate. We are two public policy people. We are in the politics arena, and especially as Republicans, we need to have an opinion on this. We need
Yeah.
to be educated and informed and have an opinion on this. And I think the way you do that is by reading all the stuff that we did before this, and by having this conversation, and by, hopefully getting yelled at on Twitter by somebody and whatever, and going back and Googling more stuff. And this is how you have policy conversations, whether or not
Yeah.
you're man, woman. We have affirmative action conversations despite the fact that we're not black. We have, WIC conversations despite the fact that we're not of limited means enough that we're ever going to qualify for WIC. You can have a discussion about all these different things, even if it's not going to be part of your lived experience, I
Sure.
feel.
And one of the things that I like to do when I'm looking at kind of these contentious issues is kind of look at extreme examples where people tend to agree, and then kind of work your way to the middle and figure out, kind of really dial in that point where it becomes contentious. And so kind of with this, I look at an unfertilized egg. Basically, everyone would agree that is a woman's choice. If you want to take birth control, if you want to donate your eggs, whatever, that is between the mother or potential mother and herself, nobody else. On the other hand, you take a 2-year-old, and this is you can't kill a 2-year-old even if you are the mother. So at some point between unfertilized egg and 2 years old, there's a point where it stops being a women's issue and it becomes a societal issue. Murder is wrong, and at some point it doesn't matter who your relation to the person that is being killed. At some point in that spectrum of human development, there is a point where it stops being a personal issue and it starts being a public issue. At least that's the way that the law is written and the way the law is enforced. And in Oregon, that is at the moment of birth, and now in Texas, I guess it's 6 weeks after
6
conception.
weeks, yeah.
So I think that it is worthwhile to have the conversation, and being men, I think that again it's debating where that line is, where does it become a public policy decision? Where is it now society's responsibility to protect that human life, whereas prior to that point it was the woman's choice.
Well,
So-
and I think you just hit on an interesting point that is, I think, a little bit where the two sides kind of come at loggerheads. And for those, most of the people listen to this instead of watching it on YouTube, which you should watch on YouTube. We just took 20 minutes to get the camera up and working. Yeah, it took a while. We had to refill our cocktails. But I just did my two hands waving in the air and not being able to interact. And I feel like on the individuals on the left see this as an issue of healthcare, of women's choice, of privacy between a woman and her doctor, and those on the right see this as an issue of the sanctity of life and where does life begin. And I
it's
feel
both.
like
It's both.
I was gonna say
There is a point where it switches from one to the other.
It is, yeah. It's always going to be both of those issues, and I think both sides, frankly, are at least somewhat bald-facing hypocrisy when you kind of talk about that. I'll start with the Republicans, just because this is what we do on this podcast is rag on Republicans. But Republicans love to describe themselves as pro-life, and they'll always mean pro-life and that they are opposed to abortion. Generally, when it's a politician, they'll say they're opposed to abortion, except in cases of rape and incest, so that you don't sound like too much of a Neanderthal caveman going back to the bad old days, or if somebody rapes you, you're still forced to carry that pregnancy to term. But generally, conservatives like to describe themselves as pro-life, and a lot of times they're not. A lot of times, as soon as that baby's born, they don't care if the mother's in poverty. They don't care if the mother's got food on the table. The being pro-life stops once the baby is born.
Well, so I'll push back a little bit on that. So that is a trope that the left brings out a lot. And I think if you look at it from a conservative perspective, the conservative perspective that says you are responsible for yourself and your own family, I don't think there's any inconsistency there. I mean, what the Democrats are trying to say is, oh, well, the government should provide food, and the government should provide these things, and the government should provide baby food and healthcare and preschool and daycare, and this should all be provided by the government. And if you disagree with that, you don't really care about the baby. But I believe that in general, you are responsible for your own actions and the actions of the people you're responsible for, and we are all better off when we are responsible for our own people. And you go to your family, you go to your community if you need help. The government then is the final entity on that list if you can't get help anywhere else. But the Democratic argument is that if you don't support all of these social programs for young mothers, that you must not care about the baby, which is not true. You can support those things without supporting government sponsorship of those things.
I think that's I agree that that's true, and I won't quite go as far as the kind of Ayn Randian everybody pick everybody up by the bootstraps as you described it at the very beginning. But I do obviously I'm still a Republican. I'm with you on the idea that any individual needs to be responsible for himself, whatever his lot in life is. But I also think that I don't see the government's role per se as just providing food and shelter and jobs and transportation and all these wonderful things to any individual who asks. I do see the government's role as kind of establishing an infrastructure and making sure that any individual does have the ability to pick himself up by the bootstraps. I think oftentimes that ends up being lost. And this is when we had our, I want to say like second or third or fourth episode of this podcast. One of the points that I made about abortion was if we were really pro-life, if we're really the pro-life party, we would advocate for more comprehensive sex ed in schools, more access to contraception, a bettering of the adoption system, lowering the costs, easing the amount of red tape, ensuring that children who are ready to be adopted can go meet these wonderful foster families, ensuring that mothers who are not interested or not able to provide care for a newborn have a means to fall back on and can put the child into a foster care system, knowing that child will be adopted and loved and part of a family that has the means to take care of it.
Sure.
But I think that there's a lot more that the GOP could do to be pro-life.
Sure.
I also think on the left, I mean, kind of like you said, everybody said, well, this is a woman's issue. This is healthcare. Well, at some point, 50% of those babies that are aborted are women, statistically. Those women didn't have much of a say in the issue, and we can have an argument about where life begins and at what point is it the taking of a life. I'm of the Ronald Reagan, I don't know, but I don't want to take any chances. I honestly don't know when life begins, if it is at conception, if it is at the moment of birth, if it is the moment where it's medically viable, somewhere in between. We can all have our debates on that. I'd just rather not take any chances. But I think if you come at it at the argument of, well, this is totally a healthcare thing, you're missing a vast swath of what the individuals on the right are upset about, and that leads to us to the stalemate that we've got now.
Well, I mean, you get to a point where it just becomes political, and it becomes your tribe, and it becomes the talking points. It's really hard to have one of these like in-depth conversations without just bringing it down to the. No, nobody has this conversation. Everybody just sticks to their talking points. Very rarely does anybody talk about this. But interesting, you brought up that whether or not it's a human life, and I think the way that you not really get around that's the wrong term, but the way that you are pro-life or pro-choice, regardless of whether or not it is a human life, is the idea of bodily autonomy, or I guess now they're calling it bodily sovereignty, where you are in control of everything that happens into your body medically, and no one can take that away. No one can make you do something to your body that you do not consent to, regardless of the consequences. And I think that that's what goes on here in Oregon, because, like you said, the law in Oregon is up to the moment of birth. You can get an abortion at 9 months even, and it's perfectly legal. The only difference between a baby the moment before it's born and the moment after it's born is whether or not it's relying on the mother and is inside the body of the mother. And if you believe in that concept of bodily autonomy or bodily sovereignty, it doesn't really matter if it's alive or if it's a human, because the concept of autonomy of the woman's body, the my body, my choice movement, supersedes that in a sense. And let me give you another example. Are you an organ donor?
I am.
I am as well. But if you decided not to be an organ donor, all your organs when you die just get buried in the ground with you. Doesn't matter that it could save half a dozen lives, that your kidney or your spleen or your whatever could go to another person who's in need and save that life. You, even after you're dead, the idea that you have autonomy over your own body is consistent throughout our law and throughout our culture. It's not something that we talk about a lot, but it's if you look at how we deal with people, everything from organ donation to blood draw to abortion to like all of this kind of follows that same principle of you control everything that goes in and out of your body. I think if you try to make the argument that it's not a baby one moment before it's born, it's not a human one moment before it's born, I think you're not. I don't think you have a good argument there, because physiologically it's the exact same thing before birth and a moment after birth.
And so, I think that that's a very fair point. And I'd honestly, this would have been a great opportunity for us to have had a person who is pro-choice on this podcast, because this is kind of where
I would say that I identify as pro-choice.
Well, we do have a pro-choice person on this podcast.
But it depends on how you define it. I mean, I think Oregon Right to Life would define me as pro-choice, but I think that the Democratic Party would probably not.
Well, and I feel like that's also fair. It's like you and I are in the middle ground enough on a lot of different issues that if like we go look at our Menchies on this after, like if it's Democrats that are talking like these right-wing zealots defending this, which neither of us has defended the Texas law, and I won't speak for you, but I don't think either of us is going to.
No.
But look at these crazy right-wing zealots. They think that they can talk about abortion. Whereas if we go to the next Multnomah County Republican Party meeting with a lot of hardcore Trump supporters and whatever, they're going to look at us and they say, who are these guys? Aren't even Republicans. Kick them out of the party. They had the audacity to say that maybe abortion shouldn't be totally illegal, outlawed every single instance of every single mother.
If anyone is curious what the Multnomah County Republicans think of me, just Google James Ball Multnomah County Republican Party, and there's a Willamette Week article that sums it up pretty well.
Spoiler alert, it's not good. They are not your friends.
They don't like me.
That's not the way that goes. But it does end up being interesting, because it really is you do have to decide at one point if you are a liberal, if you are a leftist, if you are pro-choice, as any individual choose to define him or herself, where you're comfortable drawing that line for yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think this is another way a lot of individuals who are pro-choice say, well, I personally would never get an abortion, but I want the right to exist for other women out there in case that they are not of similar belief as me, or not of similar means as me. I get that argument. But at the same time, I would never say like, well, I don't want to commit arson, but if somebody else really wants to.
Yeah, there was a quote from, it was attributed to Pete Buttigieg, but it was on Facebook, so who knows who actually said it. It could have been the guy who posted it. But basically said where you draw that line should be up to the woman having the baby. That line you will not cross should be an individual decision and not dictated by the state. And I understand the sentiment, but at a certain point, it becomes murder. Like I said before, like at the moment of birth, it doesn't matter if you consent to killing your child. That's murder, and you're going to go to jail. So if you you cannot execute your toddler. Like that's there is a hard line in the sand that you cannot cross.
I think it's like 20 years old now, but there was an episode of South Park where Cartman's mother is trying to learn more about abortion, and she goes through and like meets all these different people at different levels of government, and finally she ends up talking to Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton says, "How far along are you?" And Cartman's mom says, "Well, he's 8 years old." And Bill Clinton is like, "What is wrong with?" And she says, "Oh, sorry, I don't mean abortion, I mean adoption. How old can the child be before I can give him up for adoption?" and that's a little bit I feel like the point
It's
that
South
you're making
Park,
is
but
like,
yeah.
of course, well, and again, I guess I shouldn't speak for everybody. There's probably some very far left person who would say, yeah, no, it's anytime the mother wants, you should be able to abort your baby, even after it's born. But I'd say most people are in agreement with you that
there's a hard line at some point. And
At
so,
some point,
so
yes.
I agree with you, Mayor Pete, Secretary Pete, whatever you're going by these days, that for most people at certain point that it is their decision of what line they will not cross. But at a certain point, it becomes a public policy issue. And that's what we're debating. We're not debating people's individual, what they're willing to accept or what they think is a life versus not a life versus murder versus just a healthcare decision. That's not what we're debating. We're debating that hard line where it does become killing a human being. And
where if you're an Oregonian liberal and you draw that at the moment of birth, that's where you draw that line. If you are a Texas Republican and you draw that line at 6 weeks because that's when there's a viable heartbeat. If you're probably the majority of the country and you draw that line somewhere in between. I think in Roe it was at the third trimester, and I think now as medical technology has progressed, you can reasonably have medical viability of a fetus outside the womb at 20 weeks, 18 weeks, 16 weeks. The time is always going to get shorter and shorter and shorter. And so at some point it is going to be 6 weeks before, hey, that child, that fetus, that
is viable
mass of cells in your
outside the
womb is viable. Yeah.
And that's why I think that the idea of body autonomy or body sovereignty is so important, because it just kind of sidesteps that issue of what's viable or what's a heartbeat or where does it feel pain, or like all of those issues are kind of nebulous. They're kind of arbitrary in a sense. If you look at it as the woman has complete autonomy over her body throughout the pregnancy, then I think that's really the morally consistent way to look at abortion. Either that or if life begins at conception and everything after that is murder.
So I
don't know that anywhere in the between is really morally consistent.
And I honestly, since you brought that up, so now I'm curious, because this has been kind of a fun development of the last 6 months is since we're talking about moral consistency, the anti-vax, anti-mask crowd.
I was just going to bring that up.
Exactly, like all these individuals who are hardcore right-wing zealots who don't want to, despite the numerous myriad studies that show the efficacy of masks in stopping the spread of the coronavirus pandemic that we're still, believe it or not, going through because people still don't want to get vaccinated, believe it or not.
Which we're both vaccinated. Vaccines are safe, they are effective. Get your COVID vaccine, people.
Yeah. For the love of God.
This is not just do it.
If you're listening to this and not vaccinated, please go get vaccinated.
Go get vaccinated.
But there's a number of individuals on the right who are out there running around, and they say the state doesn't have a right to force mask mandates on anybody. If a private business wants to open and not have mask mandates, or if I just want to walk into any restaurant, whatever, there's no right that anybody has because it's my body, my choice. And if a woman has a right to abort a pregnancy, then I have a right to not wear a mask, which I find fantastically interesting. First and foremost, because these are the same people who've been yelling at women for the last 40 years since Roe and saying, no, you don't get my body, my choice. You don't get to decide. That's an actual person inside you. When they're going to infect just as many people, it's not your body. If I have COVID and I don't wear a mask and I infect 10 or 50 or 1,000 people, that's not my body, my choice anymore.
Yeah, and I think that, well, the mask thing is a bit much, but they're going into the vaccine thing, where I think that's much more similar in that it's a medical procedure that is either being, mandated or prevented by the government, and both of those things violate that idea of or that concept of bodily autonomy. The government should not be able to force you or prevent you from doing anything you want to your own body. And like I said, this is not James's opinion. This is consistent with our culture and our law. And again, it regardless of the consequences, if you look at a baby one moment before it's born and one moment after it's born, physiologically they're identical. Like there is nothing different between that. The only difference is whether or not is this idea of the mother's autonomy over her own body. So you take that to the vaccine debate, And if the government is now able to take away your body sovereignty, but only if it's really super duper important, they're not going to take it away for everything. So don't worry about that. But if it's really, really important, they can take it away. Well, as soon as you do that, as soon as the government gets to define a right, it's no longer a right. Now it's an opinion. Now there's a threshold where above this threshold, yes, the government can make you get a medical procedure, and below this threshold, they can't because you have autonomy over your own body. As soon as you introduce that threshold, where that threshold is becomes a matter of opinion. It's no longer an unalienable right. Now it's your opinion versus someone else's.
So, and it's funny because I almost completely disagree with that. I think that there are instances where, obviously the default is let individuals choose what they think is best, let individuals make their own decisions and run their own way in life. But there are instances where, because it is super duper important that the government...
You have to be compelled to do something?
You have to be compelled to do something. And the first thing that comes to mind is driving on the right side of the road. Unless you're in England or the Bahamas or like 6 other countries or whatever. I have the freedom to drive a car.
So let me
my tax dollars paid for the road. I should be able to drive on the left side of the road. And the government comes in and says, no, it's super duper important that you don't do that.
Let me stop you right there. It only really applies to medical procedures. That's kind of where this thing goes. Whether it's abortion the day before it's born, or whether or not you're an organ donor and you want your organs buried with you rather than going to save lives, or if you don't want to give up your blood, or you don't want to take a blood transfusion, you want to decline care at the hospital. It's really just as in the medical field. So it's not really driving on the right-hand side of the road. It's medical procedures.
But we can at least agree that there are instances in which, because it is super duper important, the government has a right to restrict our freedoms.
Yes.
So we're there on that. I agree that driving on a road, at least until if you're driving on the left side of the road and you crash head first into somebody and you both end up in the hospital, at least until that point, it is not a medical instance.
Right.
Then it becomes a pretty darn important medical instance. The thing with the vaccines that gets me, honestly, is not the issue of choice and autonomy and freedom and privacy. The issue that gets me is, why are we debating this in the first place? And I'm certainly with you in that if the government comes out and says, Facebook or Google just invented this chip and it's going to make everybody's lives better and it's going to make everything a lot more efficient, so we're going to mandate that everybody goes and gets this chip so we know where you are and you can text each other via your thoughts or whatever, then that's going to be a bridge too far. But if it's a vaccine where we say this is going to be a thing that saves lives, especially now in 2021 where we've had vaccines that have saved lives for decades and we've mandated them for decades, why is this an argument that A, we're having in the first place, and B, that we're having right now?
Well, so you're arguing for the threshold.
I'm arguing for the threshold.
But once you have a threshold, once there exists a threshold, whether and this goes to the Texas thing. In Texas, their threshold is 6 weeks. That above 6 weeks, that is a point where the government is allowed to come, and it is important enough that the government can dictate what you do with your own body after 6 weeks of pregnancy. So, I mean, once you introduce a threshold, where that threshold is up for debate, and somebody can have a different opinion than you. And I don't agree with the Texas law, and you don't either. We've been talking about this already. But if you're going to introduce a threshold, you have to accept that somebody's going to disagree with you. And if you live in Texas, you can't have an abortion after 6 weeks. And that means that they dropped that threshold from global pandemic all the way down to 6 weeks of pregnancy.
So, first off, I think being pregnant and a global pandemic are two very different things.
I don't think so. You're talking about life or death situations for people that are other than you.
And I think the second point is, usually when somebody relies on the slippery slope argument, it is because he or she understands that the point in and of itself is valid and it's no longer worth arguing about that point, which I respectfully...
This is not a slippery slope argument. This is an actual thing that happened.
I think that you do realize that vaccines are good and important, and I know that because 45 seconds ago we both just talked about it and said so. I think that, sure, obviously, there could be some bureaucrat who gets elected who takes things too far. just like what
They
happened
just
in Texas.
did.
And let me ask
This is
you,
not a hypothetical slippery slope. This happened.
and so let me ask you, do you think that there will be lawsuits about this in Texas?
Yes.
Do you think that there will be seats lost in the Texas House and the Texas Senate over this?
I don't know. I don't know Texas well enough to tell you that.
Yes, the short answer is going to be yes. Do you think that there's going to be court cases about this?
Yeah.
Do you think there's going to be public policy discussions about this?
There already have been.
That's exactly right.
But I think it's going to take
This is what
2
happens
years.
is when you set a threshold, is the public gets to have input and the public gets to go back and say, you get to course correct because somebody went too far. We get to come back and say, no, we as a society are going to say this is wrong, which the Texas law is. They clearly wrote that law to circumvent Roe. They tried to get around Roe. They know that what they're doing is legal. There's already, I just saw yesterday, there's a doctor who's been performing abortions, begging to get sued. He's been going out talking to people, trying to get sued so that it can go through the process in court because he knows it's not going to stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah.
And this is what happens is it's not about whether or not you set a threshold. It's about whether or not you have enough engaged, informed public debate and you can actually get legislators and lawmakers to do the right thing. And this is the whole premise of our country is based on an informed electorate where we have individuals representing our interests. You and I are not elected to anything, but we have individuals
Not
at
yet.
the
Not
state
yet, we're
rep,
not.
the state senate, the congressional level, the senatorial level, or at the gubernatorial level, and at the presidency, all supposedly representing our interest. Some of those are doing a great job. Some of those are doing a lousy job. And you and I get to go out and we, on this podcast, we sit and talk about it. Well, we live in Oregon, so most of them are doing a lousy job. But how bad of a job that they're doing. We try to go and tell people, say, hey, this needs a course correction. This is important. And I probably, if I'm a betting man, our next episode is going to be the redistricting maps because this is September 22nd. They just came out yesterday. Oregon did a horrible job with that. They also did
the
a
final
course
ones come
correction.
out? No, they're still going to go through the courts.
They're definitely
Yeah,
still going to go.
they're gonna
They're going to go through the
they're
courts.
terrible.
They're terrible.
Yeah.
And this is exactly it. And this is what happens when somebody like Tina Kotek goes too far because Texas Republicans went too far to the right. Tina Kotek went too far to the
I'm
left.
going to disagree with you a little bit, and it comes down to gerrymandering because we're in a redistricting year, and the Republican-controlled legislature in Texas is going to redraw those lines, and they're going to protect incumbents even though they're not supposed to. So all these guys who they were talking about this on the 538 politics podcasts, where red districts get redder, blue districts get bluer because that's how you maintain power. The majority maintains power by doing that, and Texas Republicans push through this law not because they're scared of Democrats. They're scared of getting primaried by the far right because they have made those districts so red.
I think I made that point on the last episode.
Did you?
Actually. Yeah.
Well, maybe you.
It's a good point. I don't get me
no,
wrong.
I mean, 538. Yeah, I made that. So, I'm not sure they're going to lose seats over this. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But
now,
I guess we'll see.
Let me ask you, because we here in Oregon, we had a movement, and in fact, we had an episode with League of Women Voters President Norma Terrell where we talked about this exact thing, where we were going to try to get an independent redistricting commission because Oregon is too gerrymandered. And this is somebody who admittedly was decently far to the left, but just wants to see good government. This was a bridge too far even for him. You still find a lot of lefty people who are just like, yeah, no, we should have an independent redistricting commission. There's a number of states that have already adopted something like that.
That's actually more popular with Democrats than it is with Republicans in Oregon.
They're
independent redistricting, which is I find super interesting.
Yet stinky Ellen Rosenbaum and stinky Elena Kagan stopped us from doing that because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And
it's
instead
like 65% of Democrats support an independent commission. It's crazy.
And yet we're going to have stinky Shamia Fagan end up drawing the lines that are going to be partisan as all get out. And there's going to be like 6 Republicans elected to dog catcher posts in Oregon. That's all we're going to have in the entire state because Shamia gerrymanders those lines. But it will go to court. Whether or not it stands up to scrutiny, who knows? But there will be a continued push to have an independent redistricting commission. And just like I would tell Republicans in Texas is what I tell women, or Republicans in Oregon is what I tell women in Texas. Yeah, there's going to be times that politicians have that threshold and they set it too far, and it's going to end up affecting you. Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe ended up having her daughter. She had to carry her child to term because Roe versus Wade wasn't decided until her child was like 1 or 1.5 or something like that. So that law, despite the fact that abortion is legal in this country because of her and because of a lousy Dallas County District Attorney and because of a Supreme Court who really didn't know what they were doing, Roe v. Wade is very poorly decided, and we can get into that in another episode. But because of her, abortion is legal in this country. It didn't come in time enough for her. And in a democracy, in the way that we handle public policy in this country, there will be public policy casualties, for lack of a better term, because there are already women in Texas who cannot afford in terms of the law, not in terms of the money, but they cannot have the ability to go get an abortion. They're going to have to carry to term babies that they don't want to carry to term. But at the end of the day, you have to hope that and you have to trust in the idea of America and trust in the idea of democracy, that there are enough informed citizens who are going to stand up and say, no, this is wrong. We need legislators who better represent us and can actually set the threshold at the right level.
Interesting. One of the arguments I heard from a pretty far leftist on Reddit, I don't remember who said it, so sorry, I can't give credit, that what they predicted was going to happen is that this is not going to hold up to scrutiny. Like you said, somebody's going to sue. It's going to go to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court's going to shut it down. But that's not going to happen for a year, 18 months, at which point the Republican legislature will then pass another law, very similar but different enough that it's different, and then that goes into effect. And then that gets challenged in the courts, and it takes another 1.5 2 years before it goes to the Supreme Court. They strike it down again, and rinse and repeat. Until and effectively you have these unconstitutional laws that are always in effect because the court system takes so long to go through things. Meanwhile, red districts get redder. These guys are not concerned about competition from Democrats. They're concerned about far right primaries.
Further right Republicans, sure.
And the system continues. I think that you have a generational issue where people under the age of 40 or 45 are much more, I don't want to say pro-choice, but much less hardline pro-life. And so I think 40 years from now, all of the extreme pro-life people will have passed away, and I think that this will become a non-issue, but that's 40 years from now. So I think that there might be a possibility that this just perpetuates and continues forever.
There certainly exists a possibility.
Or at least for the next 40 years.
I'll point to the fact that it only seems relatively recently that there's been a serious actual effort on behalf of state legislators to... Bentley agrees with me if you guys can hear my dog barking in the background.
I think it's coming through.
Been a serious effort on the part of state legislatures. You kind of saw it in Ohio. You saw it in Mississippi. You're now seeing it in Texas to restrict a woman's right to choose. And I don't know if we are now emboldened by the fact that there's a 5.5 to 4.5 majority on the Supreme Court.
100%.
You could kind of call it 6-3. But
100%. That's why.
Certainly, I kind of think that that's the case because
they're hoping one of these will stick.
You're assuming that now there's at least 5 justices who are pro-life and who agree that Roe was poorly decided and is bad law, which it was and it is. But again, that's a point for another episode. But that there are enough to have one of these laws, like you say, stick, for lack of a better term. I don't know that means if something gets, in fact, to the Supreme Court and it goes back to the states like it was before Roe, I don't know how much more of this you're going to see. I think you might just see a lot of, you already see medical tourism. You see people go to Spain or to India or something for procedures on their eyes.
Only for people of means.
And
a lot of people can't afford to go to India for whatever.
A lot of people can't afford to go to. A lot of people can't afford from Oklahoma to get out of Missouri to get from a red state to a blue state where abortion can be legal. And if you are an individual who believes in a woman's right to choose, if you believe that an abortion is a right, then that's obviously a wrong. But this is the beauty of a democracy. We get to go vote those people out. If you believe that that's a problem, keep voting for people like Joe Biden. For as much as Sleepy Joe screws everything else up, at least he's going to appoint a lefty Supreme Court justice whenever whoever the next Clarence Thomas retires, or if somebody dies on the bench, or whoever the next president after Joe Biden is, if it's Kamala Harris, keep voting for those people, because this is the way that you go. And because as soon as that happens, some blue state is going to have a new abortion law, and they're going to make it up there, and it's going to get to the Supreme Court. It's going to be Roe 2.0, and then abortion is going to be legal everywhere else in the country again, especially if, as you say, the majority of people, the majority of younger people are, even if you're pro-life, you're still kind of a lot less pro-life than you were 40 years ago. This isn't the, Phyllis Schlafly. I think she was more of an economics purpose, but who's some far-right female conservative person.
Yeah, definitely.
Before we go, I want to talk about and are we coming up on time?
5 minutes.
Okay, good. So we mostly got into a very heady policy kind of / philosophical discussion. I'd love to talk about the politics of this for a minute.
Sure.
Because Texas just screwed us.
Us
like
Republicans.
No others. Us Republicans, pretty much anywhere in the country, but especially here in blue states, because we've had one gubernatorial candidate here on the podcast already. Whoever it ends up being, this is gonna be something that haunts him or her until the general election. Is, what do you think about the Texas law? What do you think about Roe? What do you think about being pro-choice? And in Oregon, where, pick a number, 60, 65, 70, 75% of people are pro-choice, and you're trying to win an election, a general election of all of the eligible adult voters here in the state of Oregon, how can you be pro-life but then defend something as blatantly illegal and unconstitutional as the law that Texas just passed? I don't know. What do you say to
this? Is another comment from Reddit that I thought was really interesting to see how some of those on the left think. Is the post was, hey, are you tired of Kate Brown? Are you tired of Ted Wheeler? Are you tired of the way that the state is being run? And you're thinking about voting GOP the next election? Look at Texas. This is what Republican leadership will get you. So keep voting Democrat. They suck, but there are suck. There are people. And I think you're right. I think that is the way a lot of people think. And that they are going to, Kate Brown and Ted Wheeler in particular are doing an awful job of running the state and the city of Portland, but they have no competition because everybody looks at anybody who has an R by their name and they see the state of Texas and they see someone who wants to take away a woman's right to choose down to 6 weeks, and they don't trust us. They won't vote for us. And you're absolutely right. This was tactical error on the part of Republicans throughout the country by doing this. And like you said, it's unconstitutional. It's going to get struck down by the Supreme Court probably 2 years from now, but it is. One of the other points I wanted to make, though, is who could fix this mess? Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi could get in there and define Roe v. Wade, put in law what is allowed and what's not. And why do you think that they're not doing that?
It's a fair point. There's obviously a ton of money. There's a ton of bombs to throw at the other side because this person supports X law or whatever. And obviously now you get crazy Texans doing their crazy Texan thing.
Yeah. I fully believe in 3 co-equal branches of government, and I do not believe in judicial activism. The judiciary should not be setting policy. The legislature should set policy. The judiciary interprets the policy, and the executive branch executes. They enforce it. That's how the 3 branches are supposed to work. And so what we've had recently is everybody, like the legislature, the Congress, has given up power to the executive branch and the judicial branch. And you have presidents ruling by executive order, and you have the Supreme Court making policy decisions. And neither of those things should be happening. This should all be done by Congress. And it kind of frustrates me that they are just kind of abdicating that responsibility because they're just concerned about getting reelected. And it just the Congress has become this ineffective cesspool of grifters, and I'm sick of it.
It's a good name for a punk band, though.
Anyway, we are just about out of time.
All right, so we've both already answered the who is your favorite Republican question. We got to think of another question that we can ask ourselves.
Who's your favorite dog?
Who's your favorite dog? I mean, I'm biased. I got a pug. He didn't make an appearance on video, but
he's on the podcast.
He's made an appearance on the audio, and I kind of several times before. But I honestly, until I met my wife, and this is my wife's dog, I'm a big dog guy. I had a black lab sheepdog growing up, and I like dogs that weigh 100 pounds and kind of come up to here on you, and you can go throw a frisbee to or a tennis ball to or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, that's more like my dog, Charlie the Husky.
Charlie the Husky, yeah.
He is 95 pounds. He is a big boy. And he also was my wife's dog who I inherited when we got married. So,
two for the price of one. That's you and I are
right?
both. We're signing up for more than we're bargaining
Love
for.
it.
Married the women, our true loves, and we got a little bonus gift to go with it.
Exactly.
Madeline, I hope you're listening.
Rebecca stopped listening to this a long time ago. Anyway, listeners and viewers, thanks so much for tuning in this time, and we will talk to you next time. Thanks for listening to the Rational Republican podcast. Your hosts are James Ball and Nick Perlosky. The show today is brought to you by ProLift Garage Doors of Portland, serving the greater Portland metro area for all your garage door installation and repair needs. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, you can email us at james@jamesaball.com or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can find our episodes at jamesaball.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts.